Harvey was my first hospice patient. He was an elderly Jewish man who had no living relatives. I would sit with him in his room speaking Hebrew, discussing Israel and reciting Jewish prayers. Harvey had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and a terminal illness, for which the doctors had given him 3 months to live. Every visit, Harvey would look at me like he had never met me before, and I would have to reintroduce myself, making him feel comfortable with my presence yet again. Each time was different, and some days were better than others. Sometimes he would yell at me. Other times he would want to talk for longer than I could stay. As the weeks passed, I came to realize that it was almost impossible to create a real sustainable relationship with Harvey, considering his Alzheimer's diagnosis. But I still felt that my presence was helping in a certain way anyway. And he became special to me. And then there was this one day when I came in for my shift and one of the nurses took me aside. And she told me that Harvey had been asking for the girl who speaks Hebrew with him. He had been asking for me. Somehow the time that we were spending together had broken through his sickness. It had broken through when nothing else did. And he was remembering. Harvey died 2 weeks later. The emptiness of his room has stuck with me like a weight throughout my life. Although the faces of all my patients have stayed with me, I remember Harvey's most clearly. His death was the hardest death I dealt with while volunteering in hospice care. I was in high school when I decided I wanted to become a hospice volunteer. Hospice is an institution that admits people who have chosen compassionate care and emotional and spiritual support for the last 6 months of their lives and who are no longer seeking a curable treatment. At 16, I didn't fully realize what I was signing up for or anticipate the kind of impact this work would have on me. But I still walked into that residential hospice facility each week, ready and motivated to have conversations with dying people. Have you decided where you want to die? Have you chosen your healthcare proxy? Are you ready to have a conversation with someone who's actively dying? Have you considered that could be anyone in this room, including you? You see, we are all mortal, and we are all going to die someday. And in our American society, we don't like to talk about death and dying until we are forced to in a crisis. Certainly, our millennial generation is too young to talk about these issues, right? Wrong. I am here to tell you why our generation needs to change the dynamic of avoidance surrounding issues related to end-of-life care. Why it is up to us to start talking more openly, more normally, and more comfortably about what matters most to us about living and what matters most to us about dying. We can change this culture so no one is left in the dark, wondering what our mother or our grandfather would have wanted. The earlier we start, the better prepared we will be for the deaths of the people close to us and for our own. While I was volunteering, I covered far different topics with my elderly patients who were dying than I did with my friends and my family. I visited Mr. Simon twice a week, age 97 with prostate cancer, who only wanted to talk about New York City in the 1920s. We would flip through this one illustrated book, and he would point out to me the Lower East Side, the elevated Avenue L train, food vendors in Central Park. I visited Dick, age 89 with leukemia, who only wanted to listen to Mozart and Beethoven. I visited Maggie, and we'd flip through fashion magazines, and she would tell me about when she wanted to be an actress and all of her stories from casting calls. We talked about memory and meaning, beauty and loss. The conversations felt big and full of life, not death. I was assigned 3 to 4 patients at once and would visit them twice a week. And one by one they would die, and I'd simply get assigned another just like that. And to be honest, it became a reality of mine. I cultivated an understanding that I had done my job, to be present, to share their joys and tears, and to have hopefully made their last days and weeks a little more bearable and a little happier. Sometimes, though, there were no stories. One day, I was assigned to sit with a man I never met before. When I walked in, he was lying in his bed, his eyes closed, his body completely still. I sat down, nervous, but with a commitment to stay at his bedside. It is called sitting vigil, spending time with someone in their final hours, ensuring that they do not actively die alone. All of my fears about death suddenly surfaced. What would it be like? Unable to move, unable to speak, unable to communicate my needs or feelings, unseeing, but possibly conscious enough to know that I'm still dying. How afraid and how alone one must feel. I recalled a doctor telling me one time that one of the last senses to leave the body when someone is actively dying is their hearing. Suddenly, I felt that being with this man, this stranger, was the most important thing in the entire world. I took his hand in mine, and for the next 3 hours, I whispered to him softly that I was there and that there was no need to be afraid. I let him hear my voice and spiritually feel my presence. I wanted him to know that there was someone there, someone who cared, and that he was not alone. He died that night only a few hours after I left. I had been the last person to visit him. I was upset in a different way than I had been when Harvey died because I had no prior understanding of who this man was. I just felt deeply connected to him anyways. He helped me realize what I want to think about at the end of my own life, that I want someone there, holding my hand, telling me that I'm not alone and that my life mattered enough for someone to sit with me through a long vigil. But if I hadn't just told you all that, and if I wasn't prepared to talk to my family about it later, no one would ever know what matters to me, how I would want to be treated at the end of my own life. When I got to Tufts, I wanted to continue my work in education and end-of-life care. I found a place for it when there wasn't one. I connected with the Conversation Project, a national public engagement campaign dedicated to ensuring that every single person's end-of-life wishes are expressed and respected. Through my work with them, I was supposed to reach students across campus and engage with them in this kind of dialogue. But I was a nervous sophomore, still trying to find my place, and I didn't think that students would respond to these kinds of questions, that they'd feel too disconnected from the topic. Also, when I first posed the idea of a workshop to Tufts health service administrators and faculty, I received major pushback. They thought that the topic could lead to a rise in mental health issues and possibly even suicide. Now, I had grown accustomed to being the only one in the room comfortable with this topic, but I was surprised when even the adult administrators at my university exhibited the unease that I had faced for years when discussing my work. It is an interesting idea, but some people think that if you talk about death, it could actually happen sooner. The specter of suicide was raised. Through encounters I've had with patients, conversations I've had with family members, and discussions I've had with individuals in the field, I've come to realize how life-changing and life-enhancing the conversation can be for the terminally ill, their families, and for those of us in the prime of our lives who have been taught not to think or talk about death until absolutely necessary. Talking about death is no longer taboo for me. It is a conversation I enthusiastically welcome. With patience and conversation, the administration finally got on board and granted me permission to hold the event. It was called Death Over Dinner, where we ate pizza and talked about our relationships with death and dying. The conversations, prompted by some guided questions, got off to a quiet start. However, by the end of the evening, we couldn't stop talking. People responded to the questions in ways that I did not expect. So many young people have experienced the death of a family member or a close friend. They spoke about the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Sandy Hook, Chicago, Syria. They spoke about how death is normalized in the news while being dramatized on the big screen. They spoke about death in social media and how families maintain memorial pages on Facebook to engage with loved ones long after that person's death. They spoke about their relationships with their grandparents, their fears, and their unique end-of-life wishes. Some wanted to be in nature, by the sea, in an open field. Others just wanted to be surrounded by their closest friends and family. Surveys that I sent out afterwards revealed that students were relieved to realize that it was okay to talk about death. It was okay to talk about death. The impact of the event created a ripple effect, which was the whole point of the workshop, to change the culture by getting young people talking about this topic. Even among my friend group, conversations became more ordinary, easier. Students reached out to me about ideas and thoughts that they had, books that they were reading, conversations they were having with their family members. A close friend of mine even choreographed a dance inspired by the event that was then seen by hundreds of students. As millennials, it is incumbent on us to change the dynamic of fear and awkwardness surrounding this issue. We can replace the fear with a sense of control in our lives that will grow with us, that we can then teach our children. We should be engaging in conversations with each other and with older generations about how we and they want to die. By bettering the relationships with the elders in our lives and by asking them to talk about these topics, we can facilitate an open dialogue about their pasts, their fears, and their own mortality. These conversations can be empowering. Discussions on burial rituals and beliefs in an afterlife can help us demystify death and understand it as a natural occurrence in the cycle of life, a celebration instead of an inevitable end. Through sustained conversation on these topics, young people can be better prepared to face a beloved grandparent in the hospital. Ask meaningful questions. Be present. It can eliminate the barriers that divide us in the last days of a loved one's life. I spend my days thinking about these questions about death and dying and where I fit into the conversation. We need to start talking about our options and our wishes as early as possible and normalizing this conversation so that this universal fate of ours won't be as scary, as terrible, and as loathsome as it is now. How can something that happens to every single person every single day be barely talked about, barely engaged with? We may never know what happens after death, what it is, what it feels like, but we can make the dying process more comfortable, more compassionate. We can learn to be present, and we can impact those that the rest of the world has cast off as good as gone. And we can remember Harvey, who I still miss every single day, but who I know felt a renewed sense of hope in his last weeks. And it is the responsibility of each and every one of us. We can change the way the world thinks and talks about death and dying by having one conversation at a time. Thank you.